Foucault read Marx reading Epictetus? Well, last time Marx quote-unquote read the Stoic philosophy of Epictetus as a reflection of the social and economic conditions of the Roman Empire. This read the inner discipline of the Stoics as a response to both social enslavement and control, as well as a near universal way of coping with immense uncertainty. And early Foucault wouldn't disagree. He was a 20th century French philosopher who explored how modern societies and social conditions shape the way people think, behave, and understand themselves. But he also examined how those conditions operated through a wider network of institutions, discourses, and disciplinary practices that produced particular kinds of subjects. For example, he would read Epictetus as a product of Roman institutions and relations of power, where his experiences of slavery, philosophy, and hierarchy produced a way of thinking that promoted self-discipline, emotional restraint, and regulation. As a result, Rome no longer had to overtly control Epictetus, or any other Roman for that matter, because their social practices and institutions produced self-disciplining subjects. So, if early Foucault were to read Marx reading Epictetus, he might say that while social and economic conditions produced Stoicism, Roman institutions and practices produced the kind of person who could think and live as a Stoic. And what about later Foucault? Once he had securely demonstrated that this sort of disciplinary power was everywhere and unavoidable, he then explored how individuals could create forms of autonomy through practices of self-formation. And Foucault called these practices the technologies of the self. They didn't sit outside social and institutional power, but still allowed people to actively participate in producing themselves through ethical practices. For Epictetus, slavery and Rome's strict social hierarchy continued to dominate and produce his experiences. However, his Stoic practices, or technologies of the self, allowed him to actively shape his own conduct and cultivate a particular ethical relationship to himself and his social condition. By examining his judgments, reflecting on his actions, and disciplining his desires, Epictetus demonstrated Foucault's notion of freedom, the capacity to critically analyze and modify one's relationship to power. So, if Marx were to read Foucault reading Marx reading Epictetus, he might agree that subjects can achieve a relative notion of freedom through technologies of the self. However, we would have to think that Marx would still ask us to focus on the material conditions that make these technologies of the self necessary. As such, genuine freedom and liberation would mean transforming those conditions rather than just changing our relationships to them. And finally, how would Foucault read Marx reading Foucault reading Marx reading Epictetus? Well, he might say that while technologies of the self do not automatically liberate people from systems of power, practices of freedom can gradually transform social relations by changing the kinds of subjects people become and the way they participate in those systems. Until next time, see you then.